In this, I will explore a logical foundation for Christian morality. This focuses on the importance of morality's existence, whether or not it is objective, and whether or not an enforcer is needed. This is intended to help add logic behind why some Christians believe what they do to non-Christians. If you want to be convinced, converted, or proven anything, this is not for you. Logic is one of the weakest forms of persuasion, communication intended to convince, convert, or prove. My goal is not for you to agree with me. My goal is for you to understand me. That said, try to keep an open mind. Whenever I define a term, I am using that term according to my definition and not any other definition. Let's start by defining some basic terms. A value is a qualitative measure of how good or desirable some thing, action, or arrangement is. Truth is an objective and accurate description of reality. It may, or may not, be knowable by all, or even any perspectives, but assume it exists, knowable or not. Objectivity means that something does not change with respect to perspective, and subjectivity that it does change with respect to perspective. Let's assume there are no true values. In this perspective, we can't really talk about anything. If a meteor was on its way to destroy the Earth, is that bad? We can't say. We can talk about when the meteor will hit the Earth or how much damage it would do. But we can't argue to save the Earth or let it be destroyed, because both imply that the Earth is or isn't valued worth saving. Let's agree that this perspective isn't useful for discussion. What should we use as a value system? As far as definitions are concerned, you can define an infinite number of value systems based on their internal values and then debate on which one is best. However, this approach will not lead us to any concrete answer. For example, an obvious option is truth. It is constant across all perspectives, and that makes it perfect for discussion. However, there is an immediate problem. What is truth? At this point, and I will conclude, we don't know whether or not we could know if something was or wasn't truth. The closest we can get is perceived truth. However, that defeats the whole point of accepting truth to begin with. We wanted it because it didn't change based on your perspective, and now it explicitly could. We could also define a value system in such a way that it must be the best. We want our value system to indicate how to value things such that the universe is maximally desirable to us, the people discussing the system. Note that this does not imply that it is also maximally desirable to the people in the system. Of course, we will not change our minds on what is the most desirable universe once we finish our discussion. This way, the value system is constant with respect to all perspectives because it is defined according to whatever we finally decide is maximally desirable, which we will make note not to do in such a way that changes based on perspective. Let's call this, presently undefined, system of values morality. It must exist because we defined it to exist, and we did so because it allows for convenient discussion of the world. So now, we can discuss objectivity and subjectivity. You may guess by now that the reason morality must be objective is because we made note to define it as such previously, but let's try to explore the consequences of why this definition is important. Morality, before we assumed it must be objective, could consist of no more than 4 separable components. An objective component, a subjective component, an inseparable objective and subjective component, and a component which is neither objective nor subjective. Our goal is to carefully narrow down these components to the fewest and most valuable components without losing anything important. First, let's consider the non-objective and non-subjective component. So, if this is not objective, then it does not change with respect to perspective, which is equivalent to stating that it does change with respect to perspective. But it is also not subjective, so it does not change with respect to perspective. This is a contradiction. As for the inseparable component, part of it must be objective, and part of it must be subjective, and therefore part of it does change with respect to perspective. If part of it changes with respect to perspective, we can also say that the whole changes with respect to perspective. If the whole is subjective, then it cannot also be objective because the two are mutually exclusive as we've shown previously. To discuss only subjective morality, let's agree that the annihilation of all but one human is bad. We want our system of morality to accept that value more than any other value, other than destroying all of our species. Does subjective morality accept that value? In mine, your perspective, it does, because we think annihilating our entire species is bad. However, in some other perspective, someone could think it is good. Now imagine that individual achieved that objective and was the last human on Earth. From the only perspective that exists at that time, his actions were moral. However, this is exactly the scenario we wanted to prevent. With objective morality, however, we can just declare that bad. If they do achieve the same outcome, it is bad because according to our objective definition, it is bad regardless of his perspective or opinion. My final argument was started by Plato in the Republic. The Ring of Gyges is basically the ring from Lord of the Rings and made you invisible. One of Plato's participants argued that anyone who had the ring would no longer follow justice and would run around murdering, stealing, and causing mayhem. Plato resolved this by assuming that all value systems logically contradict immoral actions. Thus, the holder of the ring would not do any of those evil things because they did not benefit the user. However, this is a narrow definition of value systems that I will not take for granted. To begin with, consider that morality, as we have defined it, cannot continue to exist without some other distinct system of values. This is because without self-preservation, those who maintained morality could perish, and thus morality would no longer exist. As the people discussing this system, it is clear that such a possibility would be a poor mark on our system as a whole. Self-preservation, you'll note, is subjective, and could logically allow genocide minus one person, so it definitely does not qualify as morality. However, in order to preserve the belief of morality, self-preservation is needed. Because the two systems of values are different, it logically follows that there may exist scenarios where the two are in contradiction. Thus, even if you hold to moral values, you must still contradict them in order to survive. This means morality is no longer objective. However, there is one way to rectify the potential for contradiction. That is, if violating moral law always results in a greater loss for self-preservation than not violating moral law. This is our enforcer. Without this enforcer, who will always punish immoral acts more severely than those immoral acts could possibly benefit the user, self-preservation would conflict with morality, nullifying the usefulness of the value system entirely. Whereas Plato had assumed violating moral law would directly contradict with any rational value system, I did not. And instead, I arrived at the conclusion that an enforcer would be needed to prevent any value system from contradicting moral law. At this point, we could just define that enforcer, God, and it logically follows that they must not be bound by the constraints of this world, otherwise it would be logically consistent to have a scenario where said enforcer could be bypassed, therefore allowing the contradiction in values to nullify morality. It does not logically follow that this enforcer, this God, must be the God of the Bible, however. As I've said before, we don't know if we could know whether or not something is true. Questions of existence can't ever be answered until we know at least that. However, if you accept that a God that enforces morality who is not bound by this world must exist, you're not far off. The only thing missing is whether or not the God of the Bible is consistent with the moral scheme most desirable to us, the people discussing morality. For that, I'd need to crack open the Bible and discuss who that God is. Beyond that, you must make up your own mind as towards whether or not the God of the Bible is our enforcer. If you notice any logical errors, feel free to let me know what the errors were in specific. Even if God exists and is perfect, that does not imply his followers would also be perfect, especially since the God of the Bible is well known for picking idiots, outcasts, and failures to act on his behalf, who continue to make terrible mistakes.